The frost had come early to Thornhallow that year, and it had come to stay. Rena Cole walked the last 2 miles of the valley road on foot, her boots breaking a thin skin of ice at every step, because the hired chaise could go no further than the flooded ford at Marsden, where the water had spread across the road and frozen into a single black sheet. She carried her own bag. She had told the driver she preferred to walk, and in truth, she had wanted the 2 miles alone, wanted to come up to the great house slowly, on her own feet, the way a woman comes to a thing she means to weigh before she trusts it. She did not arrive slowly. She heard the shouting long before the house came into view. It was not the ordinary noise of a working estate at dusk. It was the particular ragged sound of grown men who have run clean out of ideas, voices climbing over one another, none of them in charge, all of them afraid. Rena dropped her bag in the frozen ruts of the lane and ran. The road opened out above a wide mill pond that lay below the terraces of the hall, and the pond was the heart of everything. 6 men stood along its edge, and not one of them stood upon it. One held a coil of rope he plainly did not know what to do with. Another had waded 3 steps out onto the ice, felt it groan beneath him, and would go no further. And out past them all, a good 30 feet from any safe ground, a very small figure in a blue coat stood alone in the middle of the frozen pond, her arms held stiff from her sides, not crying, not moving, only staring down at the pale surface beneath her boots as though it had spoken to her, and she was waiting to hear what it said next. A child, a tiny child alone at the center of the ice, and beneath her feet, Rena could see it even from the bank, ran a long silver seam where the ice had begun to give. As she watched, it lengthened another hand's breadth with a sound like a green branch splitting in a fire. "Stand still, Lady Tamsin." "Don't you move," one of the men bellowed, cupping his hands, and the child flinched at the sheer force of the noise, and the crack ran onward toward the black, deep water at the pond's center. They are frightening her to death, Rena thought. They are going to shout that child straight down through the ice. She was already unwinding the long gray traveling scarf from about her throat. "You'll not go out there, miss." A young groom caught at her sleeve. "It won't bear a cat, that ice. His Grace has sent up to the barn for planks. His Grace's planks will arrive in good time to fish her out of the cold," Rena said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, long ago, and at some cost, that a low voice carries further than a loud one, and frightens nobody. "How deep is the water, under where she's standing?" The groom's face gave her the answer before his mouth could. "Then there is no time for planks." She looked once more at the small blue figure, and at the widening seam of black beneath it, and something inside her went very still and very clear, the way it always did when a thing simply had to be done and there was plainly no one else on this earth to do it. "Keep your men on the bank, every one of them. And be quiet now. Whatever you see, whatever happens, be quiet." And Rena Cole, 2 hours off the road, soaked to the knee, unknown to a single living soul at Thornhallow, stepped down onto the breaking ice. The ice took her weight with a long, sullen groan, and then it held. Rena did not stop, and she did not hurry, for those are the 2 mistakes that drown people. She lowered herself onto her hands and knees and went forward slowly, spreading her weight wide and flat, the way her grandfather had taught her as a girl on the frozen fenmers of her childhood, where the winters bit hard, and every child learned before the age of 7 that ice forgives the flat and swallows the heavy. Every yard. She stopped and listened to what the surface was saying underneath her. The child watched her come. She did not speak, or reach out, or cry. Rena had been told, in the careful, roundabout way people put such things in letters, that the little Lady Tamsin of Thornhallow had not spoken one word to any living soul since her mother, the Duchess, died, 2 winters gone. Looking now at that small white face, Rena believed it. The child's eyes were not the eyes of a girl of 6. They were the eyes of someone much older, who had decided long ago that the world was not to be trusted, and was only waiting with a terrible grown-up patience, to learn whether it meant to hurt her again. "Hello," Rena said gently while she was still 10 feet off. Not a summons, only a word set down lightly on the cold air between them. "You needn't say anything back. I've not come to make you do anything at all. I only thought you might like a little company out here." The dark seam of open crack lay across the ice between them, now wet and widening. Rena stopped at the very edge of it. To crawl across would drive her whole weight onto the weakest ice of all, and then they would both go into the black together. So she did not cross it. She sat back slowly onto her heels, and from the deep pocket of her coat she drew the one small thing she carried everywhere, and had never once left behind. A little bird carved from pale wood, a wren, no larger than her thumb, its wings worn smooth, first by her mother's hands and then by her own. She stood it upright on the ice. "His name is Pip," she said, "and I'll tell you a secret about him. He is not at all a brave bird. He doesn't care for high places or deep water or the shouting of loud men, and just now the poor thing is frightened of all three at once." She gave the little wren the gentlest push, and it slid out across the dark crack and came to rest against the toe of the child's small blue boot. But there is one thing our Pip does better than any bird in England. He can be still. When the world goes loud and frightening, he makes himself quiet and small, and simply waits, and the fright passes over the top of him like bad weather over a hedge. "Will you hold him for me? He's always braver in a warm hand." For a long moment, nothing happened at all. On the bank, the men had fallen silent. The frost smoked off the pond. Somewhere in the bare trees, a rook called once and thought better of it, and then the child bent down, slowly, so slowly, and picked up the little wooden wren and closed it tight inside her fist. "There," Rena breathed. "There now. The two of you can be quiet together." She reached her hand out across the crack, palm turned up and open, and left it lying there in the cold air, and asked for nothing. She had learned this in a hard school. You cannot pull a frightened creature toward you however you long to. You can only make your open hand the safest place in all the world, and wait, and let them choose it. So Rena waited. Her fingers ached, then burned with cold, the ice muttered. And the child. The silent, watchful, unreachable child, no one at Thornhallow could touch, looked at the open hand, and at the wren shut safe in her own, and reached out and laid her small freezing fingers across Rena's palm. "Good girl," Rena said softly. "Brave girl. Now we go back together, the way I came. Flat and slow and dreadfully boring, the two most boring girls in England. Lie down for me. Right down on your front. I have you and I do not break my promises." Inch by inch, breath by frozen breath, she drew the child back across the singing ice, never lifting, never dragging, only guiding. The two of them spread wide and low, along the faint scuffed line her own knees had pressed on the way out. Twice the ice cracked close beneath them, and twice the small cold fingers clamped hard on hers. "Boring," Rena murmured each time, steady as a clock. "Nothing here worth looking at," and on they went. Then there were hands above them, many hands, reaching down, and the grooms had them both by the shoulders and were hauling them up onto the hard, blessed, unmoving gravel of the bank. Somewhere a man was sobbing with plain relief, and it was not the child, for the child still had not made a sound. Rena came up onto her knees on solid ground, soaked to the elbow. She turned the little girl gently to face her and looked her over, chilled, badly frightened, but whole and alive. Lady Tamsin gazed back out of those ancient, careful eyes, and then, without a word, she opened her fist just far enough to show the little wooden wren was still safe inside it, and pressed her cold face hard into the stranger's shoulder, and held on, and would not let go. It was only then that Rena became aware of the man on the terrace above them. He stood at the head of the stone steps, in a dark riding coat, bareheaded in the biting cold, watching her with a face she could not read. He was younger than she had looked for, no more than 32, hard and handsome and shuttered. His eyes a gray so pale they seemed almost colorless in the failing light. He had not come down. That was the first thing Rena understood about Emery, Duke of Wexmore, that his only daughter had stood dying on the ice, and he had come as far as the top of his own steps and stopped, as though some unseen wall crossed the stair that he could not, to save his life, pass through. He came down now, slowly, and the men drew back to let him by. He did not kneel to the child. He looked at her. A long, starved, complicated look, a man staring at something he wanted more than breath and could not make himself reach for, and then turned his eyes away to Rena, as though his own daughter were a wound he dared not touch. "You are the new governess." He did not trouble to make it a question. His voice was quiet, cold, and entirely certain of its own ground. "I am, Your Grace." Rena rose and curtsied, soaked through and shaking, and she made it a proper curtsy all the same. "Rena Cole. I was engaged by letter. I have come a little early. You walked onto ice that would not bear a grown man." He laid it down like a charge, with nothing of thanks in it. "You might have put my daughter through it, and yourself after her, and cost me 2 lives tonight instead of 1. But I did not, Your Grace," Rena said. Something shifted far back behind the pale eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the drowned creature on his gravel had answered him at all, and then the shudder came down again. He turned to the spare old man who had appeared at his shoulder with a blanket. "Take Lady Tamsin in. Bracken, dry her, warm her. Send for Dr. Ives." A pause. "Colder than the rest. And find which nursery maid let a child of 6 wander to the mill pond alone, and turn her off before morning." "Yes, Your Grace." The Duke looked back at Rena a last time, the ruined skirts, the blue lips, the child still nodding one fist into her wet sleeve. Whatever he saw did not soften him by a degree. "You'll be paid to the quarter and gone before the thaw," he said. "A house like this eats soft-hearted women alive, Miss Cole. You'll not see out the season." And he turned and climbed his own steps and went in without once looking back. Old Bracken gathered the child into the blanket. But he had seen it. 40 years in that doorway had taught him to, and this he could not account for. In 2 winters the little Lady Tamsin had let no one take her hand, not her father, not her grandmother, not the 3 governesses before. And she had walked off that breaking ice with her fingers laced through a stranger's, and clung to the stranger's sleeve even now, as though it were the last solid thing in a sinking world. Bracken kept the thought where he kept such things, and said nothing. And Rena Cole stood alone in the freezing dusk, watching the Duke's straight back vanish through his own door, and thought a thing not one soul on that gravel could have guessed, for her name was not Cole, and she had not come to Thornhallow to teach. She had come, in secret and under a borrowed name, to marry him, to spend one quiet fortnight watching the man their 2 families had agreed over her head that she should wed, and to weigh his true heart before she bound her life to it. Watching the door close on a man who could not walk down his own steps to his own child, she thought she had her answer already, and that it was no. She could not yet know that within the week she would stand at a half-open door and overhear 5 minutes never meant for her ears. 5 minutes that would overturn everything she believed about the cold man on the steps and every plan she had made for leaving. They gave her a narrow room at the cold end of the nursery corridor, with a window that did not quite shut and a candle that guttered in the draught. And for a long while after the house had gone dark, Rena Cole lay awake in it, listening to the old timbers tick and settle around her, thinking about how thoroughly she had already failed at the one thing she had come to do. She had come to Thornhallow to be no one. Instead, within an hour of arriving, she had walked out onto a breaking pond in front of the whole household and made herself the most talkative person in the house. It was not a promising beginning for a woman whose entire plan depended upon being invisible, for her name was not Rena Cole. That was a borrowed thing stitched together from a childhood nurse and a lane near her father's gates. Her name was Aveline Hartwell, the Lady Aveline Hartwell, only daughter and sole heir of the late Earl of Hartwell, and she was worth a very great deal more than a governess's £30 a year. She was also, though not one soul at Thornhallow yet knew it, the woman the Duke of Wexmoor was expected to marry. The thing had been arranged over both their heads years before. In the amiable iron way such things were always arranged, a line in a letter between her father and the old Dowager Duchess, two proud names and two great fortunes folded neatly together, while the bride was still a girl of 15 with ink on her fingers. Her father had died believing it settled, and Aveline, now of age and free in law to refuse, had discovered that refusing was not the simple thing it had seemed from a distance. To refuse outright was to break her dead father's given word, to insult a duke and to set 2 counties whispering. To accept was to hand her whole life, unseen and unexamined, to a man she had never met. She had heard a great deal of that man, and none of it was warm. They said the Duke of Wexmoor was cold as the grave, that he had frozen solid the winter his wife died, that there had been a wife once and a nursery, and that both had gone silent in the same cruel season. But a reputation, Aveline had learned young, is the cheapest thing a rich man owns. It can be bought, polished, and mended by other people's mouths. She had once watched a dear friend married off to just such a bought reputation, a charming gentleman whom everyone praised, and who had made the girl's life a slow, private ruin from the hour the church doors closed. Aveline had stood at that friend's graveside 3 years later and made herself a vow that she would never marry a man on the strength of what he was said to be, but only a man whose true heart she had seen with her own eyes when he believed no one who mattered was watching. And where, she had reasoned, does a great man believe no one who matters is watching? In front of his servants, in front of the governess, the housemaid, the child, the small, powerless people who can do nothing for him and nothing against him, whose good opinion he need never trouble to earn. How a man treats those people when he is certain it costs him nothing is the one true account of him that cannot be forged. So she had answered the Duke's advertisement in a false hand, under a false name, and told no one, not her aunt, not her lawyers, not the Dowager herself. One quiet fortnight she had promised herself, a fortnight to watch unseen and learn the truth of him. Then, whatever she found, she would vanish as she had come, and send her yes or her no by letter from 100 miles off, and no one would ever know that the plain governess and the vanished heiress had been one woman. She had thought it a simple plan. Lying now in the cold little room, she already knew it was not going to be simple at all, because there was the child. She had not counted on the child. She had come to weigh a husband coldly, as one weighs a bargain, and instead she kept feeling against her shoulder in the dark the press of a small, frozen face that had not wept and had not spoken and had reached out of 2 silent winters for her hand. Whatever the Duke proved to be, there was now a second question knotted through the first, and it frightened her more than the ice had. What was to become of Tamsin? She blew out the candle at last, and as the dark came down, one cold thought settled over her, the single flaw in her whole careful disguise. There was one person beneath this roof who might undo her with a single look. She had met the old Dowager once, long ago. A child of 7 in a stiff dress in a southern drawing room, and the old woman had taken her chin in one hand and studied her for a long, long moment. Aveline had prayed the years, and the borrowed name would be disguise enough, but it was said of Honoria Dowager, Duchess of Wexmoor, that in 80 years she had never once forgotten a face. Sooner or later the summons would come, and Aveline Hartwell would have to sit under those ancient eyes and pray they had grown dim. The summons did not come at once, and, in the days of grace before it did, Rena Cole set herself to learn the house, for a governess must know the ground beneath her feet, and a woman weighing a man must know what he has allowed his world to become. What she learned, room by room and day by day, was that Thornhallow was dying, and dying the way a great tree dies, from the inside and from the crown down, with the bark still looking sound to anyone who did not stop to press it. It had been a beautiful house once, and that was the pity of it. The great reception rooms on the ground floor stood shut and shrouded, their furniture pale under holland sheets, their grates long cold, and the cold had a smell damp and mushroomy that told Rena a roof somewhere above was letting the winter in, and had been letting it in, unmended, for a year or more. The silver in the passage cupboards had gone black for want of a cloth. The good linen, when she looked, lay mildewing in its presses, unturned and forgotten. Half the great house was quietly rotting beneath its own dust sheets, and no one, it seemed, had said the word aloud. The nursery was the worst of it, because in the nursery the neglect wore a small face. Lady Tamsin, sole child and heir to one of the richest names in England, was being reared on thin broth and yesterday's bread in 2 chill rooms at the end of a corridor. Her fires were laid mean and lit late. Her boots were outgrown, pinching her small feet. The one nursemaid left to her, a good-hearted, overworked girl called Posy, did what she could, and it was nowhere near enough, and none of it was her doing. "There's no money for the nursery, miss," Posy told her low, on the second day when Rena asked why a duke's daughter went cold. "Leastways, that's what Mr. Rennick says, and what there's money for, that's Mr. Rennick's to say." Rennick. Rena heard the name a dozen times in her first 3 days, and always in the same lowered voice. He was the steward, the agent, the man who, since the old steward died and the Duke withdrew into his grief, had come to hold the keys of everything and the accounts of everything, and to answer so far as anyone could see to no living soul. He was a smooth, soft-spoken, well-fed man of perhaps 40, with a smile that never once climbed as far as his eyes, and a way of appearing in doorways more quietly than a man of his size had any right to. The servants were afraid of him. Rena saw it in the way the talk in the kitchen died the moment his tread was heard in the passage. He paid every tradesman hired and turned off every servant, and wore at his belt a ring of keys that opened every door in Thornhallow but 2, the Duke's own study, and the shut door at the far end of the east wing that no one ever named above a whisper. And above it all, unreachable at the top of the dying tree, was the Duke himself. Rena watched him, as she had crossed a county to do. He rose early and rode out alone. He dined alone at night, a single place laid for him in a room built for 40. He never went near the nursery. He never asked after the accounts. When Rennick brought him papers to sign, Rena saw through a half-open door that he signed them without reading. Signed them the way a man throws earth on a grave, only to have the thing done and be gone from it. He had shut the door on his whole life and handed the key to the one man in the house least fit to be trusted with it. She held her tongue and kept her eyes open. It was not her place to speak, a governess 3 days in the house, a spy under a false name, and she had learned in a hard childhood how much a quiet watcher may see that a loud one never will. So she watched, and she said nothing, and every day the account of the Duke of Wexmoor grew colder in her mind, a man who would not lift his eyes to his own dying house, a man who would not cross a room to his own living child. And yet, late on the 4th night, unable to sleep, she went down for a candle and saw him, the Duke, alone, at the very end of the east wing, standing before that one locked door that even Rennick's keys did not open. He did not go in. He did not knock. He only stood there in the dark, with one hand flat against the wood, his head bowed, as still and as ruined as a man at a graveside. And after a long while he turned and walked away without ever having opened it. Rena drew back into the shadow and let him pass, and her heart was beating strangely, and she understood that she had just seen something she was never meant to see. Whatever lay behind that door, she thought was the true middle of this house. And she knew, standing there in the cold with her unlit candle, that she was not going to be able to leave Thornhallow in a fortnight, not without knowing what was behind the door and what was behind the man. The summons came on the 5th morning, carried by a lady's maid with a face like a closed prayer book. The Dowager Duchess would see the new governess at 11, and the new governess would not keep her grace waiting. Rena climbed to the old woman's rooms with her heart going hard against her ribs, telling herself the same thing at every step of the stair, that she had been a child of 7 when they met, that a borrowed name and 18 years lay between that drawing room and this cold corridor, that no one could truly reach back through so much time. She believed about half of it. She smoothed her gray skirts, knocked, and a dry old voice bade her come in. The Dowager Duchess Honoria sat bolt upright by a good fire in the one warm room Rena had yet found in the house, a small south parlor bright with pale winter sun, its walls hung close with portraits. She was very old and very small, folded into a shawl the color of a dove's wing. Her hands had gone to knots with the years, but her eyes had gone nowhere at all. They fixed on Rena the instant she entered, and did not wander. For one long, dreadful moment, the old woman simply looked at her, the way a jeweler looks at a stone handed to him with the wrong price on the ticket. "So," said the dowager at last, "you are the young woman who walked on the ice." "I am, your grace." Rena curtsied, and kept her eyes down, and prayed her face was only a servant's face. "Come here, into the light, there where I can see you. My eyes are old, but they are not idle." Rena crossed to her, and the old woman studied her at close quarters for a time that seemed to have no end at all, her knotted head tipped a little to one side. "You are not," she pronounced at last, "the article I was promised. I am sorry to fall short of it, your grace. I did not say you fell short. I said you were not what was promised, which is another matter entirely, and a far more interesting one. A woman who cannot tell those two apart will be sold short her whole life long, so mind you learn the difference." She rapped the arm of her chair with one crooked knuckle. "Sit, not there. Here, where the light can get at your face." She waited until Rena had sat. "My grandson tells me you took his daughter off the mill pond with your bare hands and a wooden bird when 8 grown men stood on the bank and wrung theirs. Is that so?" "The men were frightening her, ma'am. I only gave her something quieter to listen to." Something moved across the ancient face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of the place where one used to live. "Do you know," the dowager said more quietly, "that no living creature has been let touch that child since her mother died? Not I, not her father. Not one of the 3 foolish women who came before you and fled inside a fortnight, each wailing that the child was possessed, or wanting, or wicked." She paused. "She is none of those things. She is a little girl who watched her mother carried out of her room and never told why, and who decided, being clever, that if she said nothing and wanted nothing and loved no one, then nothing could ever be taken from her again. And she has held to it for 2 winters, heaven help her, with a will that would shame a grown soldier." Rena sat very still. "What was the Duchess's name, ma'am?" she asked softly. "Tamsin's mother," Eloan, the old woman said, and just for a breath the flint went out of her, and what lay beneath it was only grief, bare and 80 years deep. She was the light of this house. My grandson married her against every prudent counsel, and was happier than any prudent man deserves to be for 6 years. And then, one spring, she took a fever, and in 11 days she was gone, and the light went out of Thornhallow and has not been lit since. She turned her ruined hands over in her lap, and the child has her mother's face. That is the whole tragedy of it. Tamsin has Eloan's face, and my grandson, who would have walked into fire for that woman, cannot make himself look at his own daughter, because every time he does he sees the wife he could not save. So, He does not look at the child, at the house, at anything that asks something of him. He has handed it all to a smiling man with a ring of keys and called it grief, when the truth is, it is fear. The fear of ever again loving a thing he might lose. That, said Rena before she could stop herself, will cost him everything he has left. The dowager's eyes sharpened on her like two pins. Yes, she said slowly, it will. You see a good deal for a governess. Then the old woman seemed to come to a decision. My grandson said you would not last a month here. He says it of everyone. I am minded to prove him wrong, and I find I am too old to do it with my own legs. So I shall do it with yours. She leaned forward. I am giving you the nursery entire, her rooms, her table, her fires, her whole small kingdom, and I give it by my own warrant, which, under this roof, outranks Mr. Setter. Renix by some 50 years and answers to no one living but me. Set it right. Spend what you must, and bring the reckoning to me, not to him. And we shall see, you and I, what a woman who is not afraid can do in a house that has forgotten how to try. Rena's heart was beating very hard, and if Mr. Rennick objects, your grace, then send Mr. Redicatus. Rennick to me, said the Dowager Duchess Honoria, with the first cold flash of pleasure Rena had seen in that whole grey house. And I shall enjoy it very much, she sat back. You have 3 weeks, girl, before the quarter, to make my grandson eat his words. I suggest you do not waste them. And then, just as Rena rose to go, the old woman added, in quite a different voice, light and idle and terrible. Cole, what an odd plain little name. I feel almost certain I have seen your face somewhere before. She got out of the south parlor with her secret still hall, though it had been the nearest thing. I feel almost certain I have seen your face somewhere before. The old woman's words followed Rena down the stairs and would not let her go. She had murmured something about having a common sort of face, and curtsied and escaped. And all the way to the door she had felt those ancient eyes traveling after her. It could not hold forever, she knew, but it would have to hold long enough, for she had work to do now and a bargain of her own to keep, not with the Duke and not with the Dowager, but with herself. She learned of the wager on her 4th day, the way she learned most things, by being quiet in a room where louder people had forgotten she was there. There was a book kept in the servants' hall, a cracked old ledger, and in it the household set down its bets, and the newest line in the boot boy's careful hand read, Miss Cole, gone by Lady Day. The odds against her were long. Nearly every name below stairs was down for it. Even Posy, who liked her, had laid a shy 6pence on the month, and colored to the ears when she saw that Rena had seen. Rena did not mind. On the whole, she thought it a very sensible bet. She had made much the same one herself, in a manner of speaking, the night she signed a false name to a letter, and came north with a borrowed history and a wooden bird in her pocket. 3 governesses had come before her and broken on this cold house like waves on a rock. Why should the 4th prove any different? The footman Todd, a long, cool youth who fancied himself a judge of character, had put it plainest of all, not knowing she stood in the scullery doorway behind him. She's too soft for this house, he told the boot boy, tipping his chair back on 2 legs. Kind ones never keep. The master freezes 'em out, or Mr. Rennick starves 'em out. And either road they're gone by quarter day. You mark me. Rena had marked him. She bore Todd no grudge for. He was very likely right, and in any case, a woman who means to vanish cannot afford to resent being underestimated. It was, if anything, the very thing she had come north to be. She would not win them round by argument. Arguing had never once in her life gained her a thing worth keeping. A girl raised quiet in a grieving father's house learns early that the loud voice owns the room, and the soft one must find some other road entirely. She would win, the only way she trusted, by making herself so quietly and so completely useful that one morning the household would rouse itself and find it hadn't the least notion how it had ever managed without her, and the whole wager would simply lapse, unpaid, unremembered, because the thing it asked had stopped meaning anything to anyone at all. She made no speeches. She never once reminded a living soul that the dowager had given her leave. She simply took hold, one thing at a time, of what no one else would touch, and did it well, and let the doing be the whole of her argument. She began where she had been given leave to begin, with the child, and the 2 cold rooms at the end of the nursery corridor. But there was one person at Thornhallow who did mind, very much, and who did not mean to wait for Lady Day. Mr. Conder. Rennick had heard. Mr. Rennick heard everything, that the old Duchess had handed the new governess a purse of her own, and the right to spend against it, and to bring the reckoning to her grace, and not to him. It was a small thing, a nursery budget, a few pounds a quarter. But Rennick had not spent 3 years making himself the single channel through which every shilling at Thornhallow ran, only to watch a governess quietly open a second channel beside it. A house with 2 sets of books is a house where figures may be set side by side and compared. And so, from her 5th day onward, while Rena bent all her care upon a silent child and a cold hearth, Mr. Breek, Rennick began softly. In the noiseless way he did everything. To watch her back, she began with warmth, because a cold child can neither learn nor mend. On her first morning of authority, she had the nursery chimney swept, for it had not been touched in a year, and came down black and choked. And that evening, for the first time in longer than Posy could remember, the fire drew clean and bright, and did not smoke. She had the outgrown boots replaced and a proper dinner sent up. Good broth, fresh bread, a coddled egg, a baked apple with honey in the hollow of it. When the kitchen muttered that Mr. Shuka, Rennick would not like it, Rena said only, and very pleasantly, that Mr. Rennick was welcome to take the matter to her grace, and the muttering stopped, for no one below stairs had any wish to go and argue with the dowager. The child was harder than the chimney. Winning Tamsin was the slow, patient labor of weeks, and Rena went about it exactly as she had gone out onto the ice, without haste, without grasping, making herself the safest and dullest thing in the room, and waiting for the child to choose her. She did not fuss over Tamsin, or pity her aloud, or press her with questions she would not answer. She simply shared the day with her. She read stories in the evenings, never requiring the child to listen, only leaving the tale open on the air, and pretended not to notice when the small figure by the fire drifted, night upon night, an inch nearer the sound of her voice. She laid 2 places at every table and talked to the empty one, as though it might answer, and let Pip the wooden wren keep the 3rd. She taught letters by tracing them in spilled flour and in the frost on the window pane, as though it were a game and never a lesson, and slowly, the way spring comes to hard ground, not all at once, but in a green blade here and a green blade there, the child came back into the world. First, it was the eyes. Tamsin began to watch her with something other than wariness. Then it was a small hand, slipping without a word into Rena's on the stairs. Then, one gray afternoon, it was a smile, quick, startled, gone almost before it had come, but unmistakably a smile. Rena remarked on none of it. To make much of any single step would have sent the child scurrying back into her shell. She only gathered each small victory quietly to herself, the way Tamsin gathered the wren. There was one evening she would think of for the rest of her life. She had been reading aloud the tale of a girl who sews her brother's shirts of nettles to break an enchantment, and had come to the place where the youngest brother is left with a swan's wing in place of an arm, and a small voice at her elbow, rusty and low and long out of use, said, "Poor thing," 2 words, the first that Tamsin had spoken aloud in 2 years. Rena's heart turned clean over in her breast. But she only nodded and said, "Poor thing indeed," as calmly as though children spoke to her every hour of the day, and read steadily on while the firelight swam and blurred in front of her, for she knew that to make a wonder of it would be to frighten the wonder away. Tamsin never once remarked that she had spoken. But after that night she spoke a little more, here and there in small, hoarded words, and always to Rena, and to no one else in the world. Below stairs, the house began grudgingly to change its mind. It is a hard thing to go on betting against a woman after you have watched her carry coals up 3 flights with her own hands, rather than let a child sit cold and watched a motherless girl begin to bloom under those same hands. Mrs. Menace, Pethick the cook, who had laid a whole shilling on Rena's leaving, found herself setting aside the best of the milk for the nursery without being asked. The housemaids took to bringing her things, a length of good flannel turned up in a chest, a doll with a cracked face that had been the young Duchess's own. Bracken the butler, who missed nothing, saw to it that a fuller coal scuttle and a better candle went up to the nursery each evening, and said nothing of it, and looked for no thanks. Mr. Rennick made his first move against her in the 3rd week, and made it softly, as he did everything. A note came up to the nursery in his fine clerk's hand, regretting that the household purse could not be stretched to coddled eggs and beeswax candles for the sake of a single child, and requiring that Miss Cole render her small purchases to him for his approval henceforward. Rena read it through twice. She did not argue. She never argued. She simply carried the note, unanswered, up to the south parlor, and laid it in the dowager's knotted hands. The old woman read it, and something dangerous and delighted woke in her ancient face. "Leave Mr. Rennick to me," she said. No second note ever came, but Rena understood from that day that a line had been drawn between them, that the smiling steward had learned she could not be governed by paper, and that men of his sort, when their paper fails them, are apt to reach for something harder. Lady Day came, and Rena Cole did not leave. No one spoke of it aloud, but the cracked ledger in the servants' hall went quietly unsettled, and the boot boy rubbed out no lines, and the question the whole house had asked with such confidence, "How long before this one breaks?" simply stopped being asked. The Duke had given her a month. The month passed, and the house was warmer for her being in it, and the wager died the death she had always meant to die, not beaten in argument, but forgotten. The Duke of Wexmore noticed her the way a man notices the weather turning while he insists he is looking at something else. He did not come to the nursery, but he could not help remarking that his coffee came hot of a morning now, and his linen smelled of lavender, and not of damp. That when he rode in at dusk there was a light burning in the nursery wing, where for 2 winters there had been only dark. And once, only once, riding along the terrace above the walled garden, he looked down and saw them, the governess and his daughter, and Tamsin was running. His silent, frozen daughter was flying down the gravel after a bowling hoop, her face turned up to the pale sun, her mouth open in a shape he had not seen it wear since Alowan died, and the sound that reached him, thin and impossible on the spring air, was the sound of the child laughing. The Duke sat his horse very still for a long moment. Then he wheeled it about and rode the other way, as though the sight had scalded him. It was in the keeping of her small accounts that Rena found the first loose thread. She kept the nursery book herself, plainly and honestly, the way her father had drilled into her before his own house was sold. Each thing that crossed the threshold set down against the coin handed over for it, week upon week, and because she paid the tradesman at the door with her own hand, she came to know exactly what things ought to cost: a dozen eggs, a stone of flour, candles by the pound, small sums, but she carried them in her head. And one market morning she happened to see, pinned to the board in the passage where Rennick posted his quarterly reckoning for form's sake, the figure the house was charged for those very candles, and it was very near double what the chandler had taken from her own hand 3 days before. For a long while Rena simply stood there in the chill of the passage, studying that one figure. She laid no finger on the sheet, she breathed not a word of it to a living soul. But she had kept accounts since she was 14 years old, and she knew, the way one knows a wrong note in a familiar tune, that somewhere beneath Mr. Rennick's neat and smiling columns, this house was being robbed. Her fortnight had come and gone a month since, and still Rena Cole had not written the letter. She told herself it was the child, that she could not in conscience walk out on Tamsin while the girl was still only half thought. But beneath that, she knew the truer reason. She no longer knew what the letter ought to say. She had come to Thornhallow to judge a cold man and pronounce him wanting, and she had his coldness by heart. The dismissal on the frozen gravel, the papers signed unread, the empty chair he would not fill, the daughter he would not look upon. And yet there was the other thing, the thing that refused to fit the account, a man standing alone in the dark with his hand flat against a locked door, unable to go in and unable to walk away. Then, on a wet night at the end of April, she overheard 5 minutes of talk that settled that question, and unsettled every other one forever. She had gone down long after the house was abed, a candle in her hand, meaning to look once more at the reckoning board in the passage by the library, to fix its figures in her mind against what she knew the tradesmen were truly paid. But there was lamplight spilling gold beneath the library door, and voices behind it, and the door itself stood a hand's breadth ajar. She knew both voices at once, the Duke and his grandmother. She should have turned and gone straight back up the stairs. Instead, she stood still in the dark, and she listened, and she was never after able to be sorry that she had. "You cannot put it off forever, Emery," the Dowager was saying, dry and tired. "The Hartwell girls' people will want their answer. The betrothal was your father's wish, and hers. Half the county holds it settled. What am I to tell them?" A long silence. Then the Duke's voice, low. "Tell them, I release her." You would cry off, "Emery, the scandal of it. Let the scandal be mine. It is the one honest thing left in my power to give her." There was the scrape of a chair, and his voice moved as though he had risen and gone to the fire. Think what I would be asking of her grandmother, to leave her own life and come to this, a house I have let rot to the rafters. A child who does not speak, a husband who cannot. He stopped. She has never so much as seen my face. She knows me only as a name in a contract her father signed when she was a girl of 15. And on the strength of that she is, to hand me her whole life. No. She deserves better than a bargain struck over her head while she was still a child. She deserves a whole man, and I have not been one since Aloan died. Emery. I was 3 hours' ride away when the fever turned. He said it so quietly that Rena had to hold her breath to catch it. They sent for me, and I did not come quickly enough, because I would not let myself believe that anything on this earth could take her from me. I reached her an hour after she was gone. 1 hour, and I have spent 2 years learning the price of it, and I will not sign another living soul over to a man who could not save the one thing he loved better than his own life. And the child? The old woman asked very gently. You would have her grow up in this? The child is better off with anyone on earth but me. His voice cracked clean across the words. You think I do not see it. You think I do not know that girl has begun to laugh again, for the first time since her mother went into the ground, and that it was not I who gave it back to her, but a governess I tried to turn off in the cold. I cannot even look at my own daughter grandmother. She has Eloan's eyes, and every time she lifts them to me, I am 3 hours away again on a wet road with the fever turning, and a silence, terrible and complete. She deserves better than a father who flinches from her face. They all deserve better than the ruin of me. Let me give them the one gift within my power, to take myself out of the reckoning and set the Hartwell girl free. The Dowager was silent a while. It is a strange thing, she said at last in a different, shrewder tone. You will not set foot in the nursery, and yet you have contrived to learn every small thing that happens in it, the hot coffee, the opened windows, the child laughing in the garden. You watched that governess of yours, Emery. The way a half-frozen man watches a fire he will not let himself go near. I do not know what you mean, the Duke said too quickly. I think you know precisely what I mean, and I think it frightens you more than Rennick's figures and the falling roof together. There was a long silence, and when the Duke spoke again, his voice had dropped almost to nothing. She walked out onto ice that would not hold a grown man, for a child that was nothing to her in her first hour under this roof, and she has never once, in all the weeks since, been afraid of me. Not for a moment. Do you know how long it has been since anyone in this house looked at me and was not afraid? A pause. Of course I have watched her. I should be a stone if I did not. Which is one more reason the Hartwell girl must go free. It would be a sorry return upon a contract, would it not? To give a woman a husband whose eye had already wandered to the governess in his own nursery? Better, I end the thing cleanly and never trouble either of them again. For a long moment there was only the crack and settle of the fire. And if the Hartwell girl, said the dowager slowly, seeing all of this, should choose to stay, then she would be a fool, the Duke said. And I would love her for it beyond anything I have any right to, which is precisely why I must never give her the chance. Rennicole stood in the dark passage with her cold candle unlit in her hand, and felt the whole careful account she had been keeping of the Duke of Wexmoor tear straight across, and refused to add. For she had come north to find out one thing only, whether the true heart of this man was one she could trust her life to, and she had just heard it. She had heard a man who would take a public disgrace upon his own name rather than deceive a stranger into a cold marriage, who blamed no one on earth but himself, who loved his child so much he believed the kindest thing he could do was give her away. He was the most honest man she had ever listened to in her life, and he did not know a single soul had heard him. And she was standing in his house under a false name, wearing a false history, keeping from him the one truth that mattered, that the Hartwell girl he was breaking his own heart to set free was not 100 miles to the south at all. She was 10 feet away, in the dark, listening, and the governess whose fire he would not let himself sit beside. That was she, also. Both women the Duke of Wexmoor was trying so hard, and at such cost to do right by, were one and the same woman, and that woman was deceiving him with every breath she drew. She could keep her silence. She could slip away in the morning, let his noble letter go south to an empty house, and remain Miss Cole forever, or no one at all. Or she could do the single thing she had sworn on her friend's grave she would never risk, step out of the shadows and tell this good and grieving man exactly who she was, and watch what she had done to him land in his face. But not yet. First there was a smiling thief with a ring of keys, and a robbed and rotting house, and a child whose inheritance she would not leave in the hands of Mr. Rennick. And so, standing in the dark, Rennicole made herself a promise, colder and harder than any she had made on the ice, that before she confessed her own mask, she would tear the mask from the man who had earned it, whatever it cost her to do it, and whatever it cost her to be found out in the doing. She did not write the letter in the morning. She did not write it the morning after that. The little traveling desk stayed shut, and the fortnight she had allowed herself stretched into something with no name and no end, and Rennicole, who had come to Thornhallow to make a cold, clean judgment and be gone, found that she had, without ever quite deciding to, thrown in her lot with a robbed house, and a man who did not know her true name. She told herself it was strategy. She could not break Rennick and vanish the same night. The thing wanted proof, and proof wanted time, all true. But it was not the whole truth, and she had promised herself long ago that whatever mask she wore for the world, she would never lie to her own heart. The whole truth was that she had heard a man break himself open in the dark for a stranger's happiness, and she could not now unhear it, and she no longer wished to be anywhere on earth but under the same roof as the owner of that voice. The Duke changed slowly, the way the season changed. It began with a doorway. One evening, reading by the nursery fire, Rena looked up and found him standing in it, the Duke of Wexmoor, who had not crossed the nursery threshold in 2 years, halted on the very edge of the room as though the carpet were ice that might not bear his weight. He had come, he said stiffly, to see that the chimney had truly been mended. He did not look at the chimney. He looked at his daughter, who sat on the hearthrug with the wooden wren and her slate, and who had gone very still at the sight of him. It was Tamsin who broke it. She got gravely to her feet, crossed the perilous distance to the doorway, and held up her slate to her father without a word. On it, in the wobbling capitals Rena had taught her, she had written one word, Papa, and beneath it drawn a tall stick man and a small stick girl, holding hands. The Duke looked at the slate. He looked at his daughter's upturned face, Eloin's face, and for the first time in 2 years he did not flinch from it, because he had nowhere left to go. He went down slowly onto one knee in the doorway until his eyes were level with hers. And Tamsin, in the rusty, hoarded little voice she spent only where it was safe, said, "Don't be sad, Papa." The Duke of Wexmoor made a sound that was not quite a word, and gathered his daughter against him, and held her as though she were the last warm thing in the world, and over the child's dark head his eyes found Rena's across the firelit room, wet and wide, and unshuttered at last, and full of a question he had no words to ask. After that night, the wall between the Duke and his household came down, stone by stone, and Rena, who had set herself so carefully to be no one, found to her alarm that she was becoming the person he came to. He came to the nursery in the evenings now, awkwardly at first, and then less so. He learned to sit on the floor. He learned his daughter's small, hoarded words. And when the child was asleep, he stayed, and he and the governess talked of Tamsin, and then of the house, and then, by slow degrees, of everything. He was funny, in a dry, rusted way, like a man remembering a language he had not spoken in years. He was clever. He was kind, in the small, unwatched ways that were the only ways she had ever learned to trust. One night he spoke to her of Eloin, and did not break. He told her he had been a coward, and that a governess with a wooden bird had shamed him back toward his own child. He did not know that every warm and unguarded word he gave her fell into her like a stone down a well, because every one of them was given to a woman who did not exist. One evening in late May they sat later than usual, the child asleep on the hearthrug between them, and the talk fell quiet, and the Duke looked at her across the low fire for a long moment. "I do not know the first true thing about you, Miss Cole," he said, "where you were born, whether your people are living, how a governess comes to read Latin, and gentle a frightened child, and stand on breaking ice without turning a hair." He said it gently, wonderingly, without the least shadow of suspicion. And that was the knife of it. You are the greatest mystery in my house, and I find I want to know the whole of you. The truth rose in her throat until she could taste it. "My name is Aveline. I came here to weigh you like a horse at a fair. I am the very woman you are breaking your heart to set free." She had only to open her mouth. Instead, she looked into the fire and said something small and light and false about a quiet country girlhood, and watched him believe it, and hated herself with a thoroughness that frightened her. He wanted to know her, and the more of himself he gave her, the surer she grew that the day he learned who she truly was would be the day she lost him. For she was lying to him still, and not in word alone, but in her whole self, the plain name, the borrowed history, the servant's deference. She owed a master she now watched across the firelight and longed to tell the truth. The better she knew him, the heavier the lie lay. A dozen times it rose to her lips. A dozen times she looked at the fragile new thing growing between them, the trust of a man who had trusted no one in 2 years and could not make herself be the one to smash it. She would set the house right first, she told herself. She would give him back his stolen money and his honest books, and then on some clean morning, she would tell him everything and take whatever came. It was a coward's bargain, and she knew it, and she made it anyway. She built her case against Rennick, the way she had crossed the ice, patiently, quietly, giving nothing away. Old Bracken helped her, though neither said aloud what they did. The butler, who had watched the steward bleed the house for 3 years and been powerless to stop it, found reasons to leave the estate ledger unlocked, and reasons to be elsewhere, while she copied its figures by candlelight. She walked out to the tenant farms on her half-days and listened. She heard how the rents had crept up while the repairs had stopped, how a widow named Sare Comber had been turned out of her cottage for arrears. She had in fact paid, in coin, into Mr. Rennick's own hand and been given no receipt, penny by penny and lie by lie. The true account of the stewardship of Thornhallow took shape in Wrenna's neat hand, a second, honest book, kept in secret, growing heavier by the week, until she knew that when it was done it would be enough to break the smiling man entirely. The widow Comber taught her the most, and cost her the most, to hear. Sarah Comber was a spare, upright woman of 60, who had buried a husband and 3 sons, and paid her rent to the very day for 40 years, and who now kept house for a married daughter in 2 borrowed rooms that smelled of other people's charity. She did not weep as she told it. She was long past weeping. She had carried her Lady Day rent to Mr. Rennick in good coin, she said, and Mr. Braun. Rennick had smiled and taken it and written her no line of receipt, and by Michaelmas the same sum stood wanting on his books, and the bailiffs came, and there was no proof in all the wide world that an old woman's word could set against a gentleman's ledger. "You'll not mend it, miss," she said, not unkindly, as Wrenna rose to go. "Better women than you have tried his Grace's steward, and gone away sorry." Wrenna said nothing to that, but she wrote down every word of it by candlelight that night, and thought, "We shall see, Mrs. Comber. We shall see about that." But she had reckoned without the patience of the man she hunted. Mr. Staddard, Rennick had been watching her since her 5th day, and Mr. Rennick was no fool. He had marked her walks to the tenant farms, and her candle in the muniment room, and at the village receiving office where he collected all the household's post before any other hand could touch it. He had intercepted a letter directed to the nursery in a southern attorney's careful script, a letter that opened, "My dear Lady Aveline." So, on a warm evening at the beginning of June, as Wrenna came down from settling the child, she found him waiting at the turn of the dark stair, smiling the smile that never reached his eyes. The lawyer's letter held up between 2 fingers like a card he had been saving a long, long time. "Good evening, my lady," said Mr. Rennick softly. "I think you and I had best have a little talk about all the things each of us has lately been so busy learning." He set out his terms there on the stair, quietly, as though remarking on the weather. He knew who she was. Lady Aveline Hartwell, the Duke's own betrothed, come into the house under a false name to spy upon her, intended like a thief in the scullery. What would his Grace make of that, did she suppose? A proud man, so lately and so painfully learning to trust again. How would he take the news that the governess to whom he had opened his broken heart was a great lady in disguise, testing him for sport? Mr. Rennick did not think he would take it well. And so, his terms. Lady Aveline would go back to being no one. She would burn her little second ledger and forget the tenant farms, the widow Comber, the doubled candles. She would finish out her season as a quiet governess, and then depart as quietly her secret kept, or Mr. Wan. Rennick would lay that letter before the Duke this very night, and let a proud man's fury do the rest. It was a good trap, and she felt it close. If he reached the Duke first, in his own poisoned way, Emery would hear only the betrayal and never the truth beneath it, and the fragile new thing between them would die in the ugliest fashion it could. Every prudent instinct she owned told her to take the bargain, keep the secret, save the little that could yet be saved. But she thought of the widow turned out on a debt she had paid. She thought of a child raised cold on stolen money. She thought of a man who had said, "Let the scandal be mine. It is the one honest thing left in my power," and had meant it, and had not known that a soul on earth could hear. And she found she could not in the end buy her own safety with their silence. She had come to Thornhallow to learn whether the Duke of Wexmoor had a heart worth trusting. Somewhere in the weeks between, without noticing, she had grown one of her own worth trusting too. "No," said Wrenna quietly, to a man who was entirely certain she would not dare. She did not go to bed. She went that same night and woke the dowager, and told the old woman everything: her name, her purpose, her proof, and the steward's threat. The Dowager Duchess Honoria listened to all of it without one flicker of surprise, and at the end said only, "I have known who you were since the hour you walked into my parlor, Lady Aveline. I never forget a face. I was waiting to see what you were made of." And at midnight she rang for her grandson. They gathered in the library where it had all been overheard. The Duke, the Dowager, old Bracken, summoned as witness, and Rena with her honest ledger in her hands. She laid it before Emery with no word of defense, for the figures needed none. Column against column, the true price and the charged price, the rents raised and the repairs abandoned, the widows paid arrears. 3 years of quiet theft set down in a hand too plain to argue with. Beside it she laid the tradesman's own tallies, and Bracken spoke, low and steady, to all he had seen and been afraid to say. The Duke read it in a terrible silence. Whatever he had believed of his own blindness, the proof of it was worse. Mr. Rennick was sent for. He came, still smiling, sure of his trap, and when he saw the ledger open on the table he did not lose the smile. But he changed his aim, for he had one shot left, and he fired it straight at her. "Before your grace takes the word of this woman against a servant of 3 years, he said smoothly, "perhaps your grace might ask the woman her name, her true name. Ask her why the attorneys of the late Earl of Hartwell write to a governess in your nursery, and address her as my lady. Ask her why your own betrothed wife has lived beneath your roof these 4 months under a false name, watching you, weighing you, laughing behind her hand." She was not laughing. The Duke's voice cut flat across the room. He had not looked up from the ledger. Now he did, not at Rennick, but at her. "Is it true?" That was all. The rest of it. "Is it true?" "It is true," said Aveline, "all but the laughing. There was never from the first hour any laughing, and because he deserved at the last the whole of it, she told him before them all that she was Aveline Hartwell, that she had come, not to mock him, but because a dear friend had died by inches inside a marriage to a man everyone praised and no one truly knew, and she had sworn never to give her life to a name and a reputation, but only to a heart she had seen with her own eyes when it believed itself, unwatched, that she had meant to stay a fortnight and go, that she had stayed. And because he would hear it now from her, or forever after from his own memory of that half-open door, that she had stood in this very room on a wet night in April and heard him give up the honor of his name to set a stranger free, that it was the finest thing she had ever heard a man do, and that from that night she had found it was not in her to leave him to a thief. The library was very quiet. Then the Dowager rose, small and terrible, and dealt with Mr. Rennick, and there was no more smiling after that. The proof was past, denying. The magistrate was the Duke's own cousin, and a man who has robbed a dukedom for 3 years and turned a paid widow out of doors finds little mercy at a country assize. Rennick was taken that night, and in the weeks that followed, the law had the rest of him. But by then he was the smallest part of what had happened in that room. For the Duke had risen from the table and crossed to the window, and stood with his back to them all. "Leave us," he said at last, and they went, even the Dowager with one hard look at her grandson that he did not see. And then it was only the two of them, in the room where she had overheard him, and Emery turned and looked at Lady Aveline Hartwell with a look she could not name, and said, "You came to find out whether I was worthy of you. Emery, you sat in my nursery and mended my child. You let me speak to you as I have spoken to no one since my wife was buried. You heard me, here, on the worst night of my life, say the truest thing I have ever said, and you let me go on believing I had said it to an empty room." His voice never rose. That was the worst of it. "I do not fault your reasons. Heaven help me, I think they were good ones, but I have learned, these 2 years, that I cannot keep the things I love, and tonight I learn I cannot even keep the one poor dignity of grieving them unseen. You have your answer, my lady. You wish to see the man behind the name, and you have seen him, every broken inch, more of him than I have shown any soul alive. You are free of the betrothal and free of me. I'll not hold you to a word your father gave when you were a child. Go home." "That is not what I want," Aveline said, and her voice shook for the first time in the whole long masquerade, "when the letter would have freed me, and no one on earth would ever have known." "I stayed. I know you stayed." For an instant, something raw and wanting broke through the ruin of his face and was as swiftly shut away. "That is the thing I cannot bear tonight. Not that you deceived me, but that you saw all of it, and I must now go on knowing myself seen. Go home, Aveline, please." And he turned back to the window and would say no more. So, in the grey of the morning, for the second time in her life, Lady Aveline Hartwell corded a single trunk to leave a house where she was not wanted. She had broken the thief and cleaned the books and given the Duke of Wexmoor back his honest house, and in the doing of it had lost the one thing she had never meant to find and had no right, she told herself, to grieve. Only there was the child. She did not know how in the world she was to say goodbye to the child. She did not have to say goodbye to the child. In the end, because the Dowager Duchess forbade it. The old woman came to the nursery at first light, leaning on her stick, and found the corded trunk by the door. She looked at it, and she looked at Aveline, and she lowered herself into the nursing chair with the air of a woman prepared to hold her ground until the walls came down. "Sit," she said. "You have made every hard choice in this house correctly for 4 months, and now at the very last you are about to make an easy one wrongly, and I have not the patience left to permit it." She had already spoken to her grandson. She said at length, and not gently, "He is not angry that you deceived him. He is a clever man and knows a good reason when it is laid before him. He is angry because you saw him weep, and men of his sort would sooner be robbed than pitied, the ancient eye softened by a degree. But I have lived 80 years, child, and I will give you the whole of what they taught me. It is a rare and a terrifying thing to be truly seen by another soul. Most people live and die without it, and call the lack of it peace. My grandson made a fortress of his grief these 2 years, and last night you walked into the heart of it and showed him you had counted every stone. Of course he told you to go. He is frightened out of his wits. That is not at all the same thing as not wanting you to stay." She rose. "I have said my piece, the rest is yours, and his, but I would not cord that trunk quite yet." He came to the nursery himself an hour later, and he looked as though he had not slept, and he stopped in the doorway where he had knelt the night his daughter wrote Papa on her slate. Aveline rose. For a moment neither of them could find a single word. Once again it was Tamsin who broke the silence. Tamsin, who had seen the corded trunk and understood it the way children understand the things no one will explain to them. She went to her father and took his large hand in both her small ones and looked up at him and said, in her rusty, precious little voice, "Don't let her go, Papa," and then holding up the wooden wren between them, "She's ours." The Duke looked at the wren. He looked at his daughter and did not flinch. And then he looked at Aveline over his daughter's dark head, and the shudder that had opened and closed across his face for 4 long months was, this time, simply gone. "I have made rather a study of signing things without reading them," he said low. "It has cost me nearly everything I had, so I have read this one very carefully, and I find that I cannot cry off after all." He crossed the room to her, the whole width of it, the way she would think ever after that a man crosses ice he has stopped being afraid of. "Aveline, I release you from your father's contract. It is only paper, and you never owed me a line of it. I ask you instead for the one thing worth the having, which no contract can give, and no father can promise. Stay. Not because a letter says you must, because a broken, half-mended, badly frightened man is asking you, a man who was seen at his very worst by the bravest woman he ever met, and finds he would rather be seen by her every day of his life than hidden from all the world for the rest of it. I told my grandmother, you would not see out the season. Stay and prove me wrong, for every season there is. And Evelyn, who had come to Thornhallow to weigh a heart from a safe and careful distance, found that she had no distance left in her, and wanted none. Yes, she said, I'll stay, not for my father's word for yours. They were married that summer quietly in the little church at Thornhallow where Eloan lay. And on the morning of it the Duke did a thing he had not done in 2 years. He walked into the east wing and unlocked the shut door and opened the windows of his first wife's rooms to the light. Not to forget her, but to let the grief become, at last, a memory a man could live beside. Instead of a locked door he could only stand outside of in the dark, he did it with Abeline's hand in his. She had never once asked him to choose between the wife he had lost and the woman he had found. She had not come to Thornhallow to replace a ghost. She had come, though she had not known it at the first, to open a window. By high summer, the house that had held its breath so long was allowed to let it go. The roof above the east wing was sound again before the harvest, mended by the honest mason, who was paid the £40 it truly cost and not a shilling over. Rents were gathered honestly now, and every one of them entered in a single plain ledger in the new Duchess's own hand. Whatever Rennick had wrung out of the tenants across 3 years was reckoned to the last penny and returned doorstep by doorstep. And what could not be got back from the man himself, for little enough was ever found on him, the Duke made good out of his own purse and thought it a bargain at the price. Sari Comber went home to her own cottage. And when, that autumn, Adeline came into her inheritance at last, the great fortune her father had left her, clear and free and entirely her own to spend, she poured every penny of it back into the land, into the tenants' cottages and the village schools she had set her heart on raising. For she had learned that the one sort of wealth no smiling man with a ring of keys can ever pick from your pocket is the sort you have already given away. Neither of them, when it came to it, had married the other's money. They had married the other's heart, seen bare in the poor plain light, where the truth of a heart is the only thing that shows. The Dowager Duchess Honoria was granted 2 more summers, enough to watch the nursery fill again and the long table drawn out for guests, and to stand godmother with immense and open satisfaction at the christening of a second child. She went in that same bright south parlor, upright in her chair to the very end, remarking only that she had always meant to be right about the girl, and was pleased to have been so thoroughly vindicated. And one warm evening, some summers on from that first frozen winter, Emery went in search of his wife, and found her just where he had known he would, in the walled garden, in the last of the gold light, watching his daughter run. Tamsin was chasing a hoop down the gravel and calling out as she went, her voice no longer hoarded now but spent freely, the way a child's voice is meant to be, and on the bench at Aveline's side sat a small wooden wren, keeping watch over the whole of it. You came here to learn whether I had a heart worth trusting, Emery said, sitting down beside her, and you never once told me your verdict. Aveline leaned her head against his shoulder. I've found, she said, that the only heart worth trusting is the one that does right when it is certain no one is watching. I heard yours do it through a door you believed was shut. She smiled, watching the child, watching the swifts cut the gold air above the mended roof. I spent my whole life afraid of the wrong thing. I thought the danger lay in being seen. It was the other way about, entirely. To be truly seen by the right person and to stay, that is the only safety there ever was. The child laughed in the garden. The house breathed warm and honest and full around them, and did not need to hold its breath any longer. And the Duke of Wexmore, who one winter could not walk down his own steps to his daughter, sat in the summer dusk, with his wife's head upon his shoulder and his child at his feet, and was seen and was not afraid.